want to start by asking you to kind of give us a status check, if you can, on sort of where we stand in the course of this pandemic. You've seen today's jobs data. People are going back to work. The economy is reopening. At the same time, we have these historic protests happening in this country. And some data show that cases and hospitalizations are increasing in at least 9 states. So where would you say we are in the course of this pandemic?
I think if you look at the nation as a whole, things are plateauing and coming down. There's no doubt about that. Certainly there are situations where you have individual locations where there may be blips. I think what we need to do, as we've said all along, is to put a lot of effort into making sure that those little blips don't become surges. But in general, things tend to be going in the right direction. If you look, for example, at the number of deaths, the curve goes down very sharply. If you look at the number of new cases and hospitalizations, for the most part, as a nation, it's plateauing and coming down. Although, as you might expect, there are some areas that are doing better than others and others that are doing worse. But on the whole, things are slowly going in the right direction.
How do you look at, I'm going to ask you a longer term forecast than you usually have to give, but to help prepare Americans for what might be in store for us, how do you look at the year ahead? What does that look like to you?
Well, what we're hoping for as we begin to carefully reopen America and get back to some degree of normality, that we will see a continual diminution in the number of cases. And with the number of cases, obviously, the number of serious illnesses and hospitalizations and deaths. As we now enter into the late spring and early summer, what we'd hope to see is that that diminution will continue. There's always the question of what happens when you get to the fall, if you're talking about an entire year. We don't inevitably have to have a second wave. I mean, people talk about it, but it doesn't necessarily have to occur. As new infections start to creep up, which they will, as we get into the fall, in the winter, it's the way we and the efficiency and effectiveness in which we put the manpower, the systems, the tests to identify, isolate, and contact trace that will determine how successful we are in preventing that wave. And I am cautiously optimistic as we continue to increase our capability of testing, increasing our capability of doing contact tracing, that when that time comes, we will effectively deal with it. So although we still are in a serious situation, Meg, I'm cautiously optimistic that if we put our effort and our resources, that we will be able to continue to go in the right direction. There's never a guarantee, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we will be able to do that.
Well, and as localities are starting to make decisions for the fall about potentially going back to school, what metrics are you looking at, and at what time point do you think we'll have enough information for leaders to be making those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, Meg, that's a great question, but it has to be a bit of a, and I don't mean lengthwise, but a bit of a complicated answer, because the United States is a large country. And as I've told you in interviews before, that there are varying degrees of infection activity depending upon the region, the state, the city, the town, and the county. So when you're talking about getting back to a degree of normality and school openings and things like that, it's always related to the level of activity of the virus. And you have to make your judgment based on where you are. For example, when you're in an area that still has a lot of activity, the way New York was some time ago, that's much different than you're in a county, maybe near Casper, Wyoming, where there may be very little activity, or in other mountain and middle western and middle country states. So you've got to be careful that you don't try to make a uni-dimensional judgment. You make your decisions, policy-wise and otherwise, depending upon the level of virus. And we have guidelines that are really clearly defined and delineated that if followed, we should, in a cautious way, do well. I hope we do. I think we will.